In November of 1720, two women stood in a Jamaican courtroom and listened to a judge sentence them to hang. They had fought harder than the men they sailed with. They had held a deck alone while their crewmates cowered below. They had been more feared in the Caribbean than most of the captains the Royal Navy had bothered to chase. And now, in a stone room in Spanish Town, the law of the British Empire was about to make an example of them. What happened next shocked every colony in the West Indies. And the story of how two women defied an execution that the most powerful empire on earth had already scheduled is one that historians are still trying to explain 300 years later. This is the story of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the two most dangerous women ever to sail under the black flag, and what the law did when it discovered it had no answer for them. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. There's a particular kind of power that empires reserve for themselves. It is not the power to... Every empire has that. It is the power to decide who gets remembered. The names that enter the official record, the faces that get carved into stone, the lives that historians a century later will consider worth studying. That power is older than gunpowder and more jealously guarded than gold, because an empire that cannot control its own story cannot survive its own contradictions. In the early 18th century, the British Empire was building itself across the Atlantic on the labor of men, the trade in human beings, and the assumption that women existed in a narrow space between obedience and invisibility: wives, daughters, servants, widows. The categories were short, and the boundaries were enforced by everything from common law to the church to the noose. The golden age of piracy was the brief, violent moment when a few thousand men decided they would no longer accept those rules for themselves. They stole ships, declared themselves outside the law, and for about 20 years, between roughly 170 and 1720, they were genuinely difficult for the empire to control. What almost nobody expected was that some women would decide the same. The story of Anne Bonny and Mary Read is the story of what happened when the cage door opened just wide enough for two women to walk through it, and what the empire did when it tried to close that door again and discovered that the hinges had been broken from the inside. The year was 1718. Woodes Rogers, the new governor of the Bahamas, had just arrived in Nassau with a royal commission to clean up the most notorious pirate haven in the Caribbean. For nearly a decade, Nassau had been a kind of accidental republic. Pirates lived there openly. They drank in the taverns, sold their stolen goods in the markets, repaired their ships in the harbor, and operated with the rough consent of a population that had given up on the idea of formal government. Rogers brought a pardon. Any pirate who surrendered and swore to abandon the trade would be forgiven. No questions asked. Hundreds accepted. Some meant it. Most did not. Among the men who took the pardon and then almost immediately broke it was a captain named John Rackham, known to history as Calico Jack for the brightly patterned cotton clothes he preferred. He was not the most successful pirate of his generation. He was not the most violent. He was charming, ambitious, and ultimately not quite as capable as he believed himself to be. He was also, in 1719, about to meet a woman who would change the entire course of his short life. Anne Bonny was born in Ireland sometime around 1697, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer named William Cormac and his housemaid. The scandal was significant enough that Cormac left Ireland with the child and the mother, settled in the province of Carolina, and rebuilt his life as a planter. Anne grew up wild by the standards of her time. She was reportedly red-haired, sharp-tongued, and possessed of a temper that her father could not control and a body that local men noticed earlier than was decent. Around the age of 16, she married a small-time sailor named James Bonny, a man whose only real accomplishment was that he annoyed her father badly enough to get her disinherited. They drifted to Nassau, where James hoped to make money informing on pirates for the new governor. Anne, by every account that survived, found her husband to be a coward and the pirates to be considerably more interesting company. Mary Read's origins were stranger, and stranger still, they were better documented. She was born in England sometime around 1685 to a widow whose first child, a legitimate son, had died in infancy. The widow had a second child, illegitimate by another man, and that child was Mary. To continue receiving a small allowance from her dead husband's mother, the widow dressed Mary as a boy and presented her as the surviving legitimate son. The deception worked. Mary grew up as a boy, was treated as a boy, and eventually went to work as a boy. First as a footboy in a French household, then as a sailor in the Royal Navy, then as a soldier in Flanders during the War of the Spanish Succession. She fought in battles. She earned the respect of the men around her who never knew. She eventually fell in love with a fellow soldier, revealed her secret only to him, married him, and ran an inn with him until he died of fever. Then, with her livelihood gone and her options narrow, she put on men's clothes again and went back to sea. The encounter that brought these three lives together happened in Nassau in the spring of 1719. Anne Bonny met John Rackham in a tavern. The affair was immediate and badly hidden. James Bonny went to Governor Rogers and demanded that his wife be publicly whipped for adultery, a punishment that the law of the colony was fully prepared to deliver. Rackham, who had money, offered to buy Anne from her husband in a transaction that the colonial period sometimes permitted between consenting men. James Bonny refused. Anne, when she heard, decided the matter for herself. In August of 1720, she and Rackham, along with 8 other men, stole a sloop called the William from Nassau Harbor. They sailed her out under cover of darkness, declared themselves pirates in defiance of the pardon Rackham had previously accepted, and pointed her at the open Caribbean. Anne wore men's clothes for the work. She handled a pistol and a cutlass. She fought when they boarded, and she fought well enough that the men who served under Rackham accepted her without significant complaint. Sometime in the weeks that followed, the crew took a small prize, and among the prisoners they pressed into service was a young sailor who was quiet, capable, and physically slight, but reportedly handy with a blade. The young sailor was Mary Red. The accounts of how Anne discovered Mary's secret vary, and the most famous version is almost certainly embellished. The version most historians accept is simpler. Anne, who had been operating in disguise herself, recognized something in this new crew member that the men did not see. The 2 women spoke privately. The secret was shared. From that moment, Anne and Mary sailed together openly, 2 women in a crew of men, and the William became something the Caribbean had not seen before, a pirate vessel with 2 female officers, neither of whom hid what they were, both of whom fought. The summer and early autumn of 1720 was the most active period of Calico Jack Rackham's career, and almost all of it was conducted in the shadow of the 2 women aboard his ship. The William was not a large vessel. She was a single-masted sloop, fast and maneuverable, suited to the work of running down small merchant craft and fishing boats along the Jamaican coast. She carried no more than 10 or 12 men, plus Anne and Mary, plus Rackham himself. Their prizes were modest: fishing smacks, coasters, small trading vessels carrying tobacco, rum, and cloth between the Caribbean islands. They were not the threat that Blackbeard had been 2 years earlier. They did not blockade cities. They did not capture warships. But what they lacked in scale, they made up for in audacity. And the audacity was largely supplied by the 2 women. Witnesses who were captured by the William and who later testified at trial described Anne and Mary in nearly identical terms. They wore men's jackets and trousers when fighting. They carried pistols, cutlasses, and machetes. They came aboard the captured vessels first, ahead of the men, and they cursed louder than the men, and they were, according to one of the most famous lines in the surviving testimony, more forward than any of the men to do anything on board. The word forward in that context meant aggressive. It meant willing. It meant that when the crew of the William needed someone to lead the boarding party, Anne and Mary were the ones who went over the rail with blades drawn. Rackham reportedly stayed back. He gave orders. He drank. He was the captain in name, and the women were the captain in practice. And every prisoner who survived to talk about it understood the arrangement within minutes of being captured. The tactical philosophy was not complicated. Pirates won by being more frightening than they were dangerous, because actual sustained combat would have ground their crews down faster than they could be replaced. The Williams crew amplified that principle by putting the most unexpected faces at the front of the attack. A merchant captain who saw 2 women come over his rail with pistols drawn was a merchant captain who surrendered faster than he might have surrendered to a boatload of bearded men. The shock did the work. By September of 1720, Anne and Mary were known across the Jamaican station. Their names had been spoken in the offices of Governor Nicholas Laws in Spanish Town, and Laws, who had been waiting for a chance to make a political statement about the recent rise in piracy off his coast, had issued a proclamation the crew of the William was to be hunted. A bounty was placed on Rackham. The 2 women were named specifically in the documents, which itself was extraordinary. The colonial legal system rarely named women as principals in any kind of criminal proceeding. The William's 2 female officers had earned the distinction by being too dangerous to ignore. Captain Jonathan Barnett, a pirate hunter operating out of Port Royal under a commission from Governor Laws, took up the contract and began searching the western coast of Jamaica. He found them on the night of October the 22nd, 1720. The William was anchored in a small cove off Negro Point on the western tip of Jamaica. Rackham and most of his crew were ashore or below decks, drinking heavily. They had reportedly taken a small turtling sloop earlier in the day, transferred her crew aboard the William as forced laborers, and celebrated the prize with rum that they had also recently stolen. The decision to anchor in plain sight on a coast where every cove was being watched was either negligence or arrogance. Probably both. Barnett's sloop, the Tiger, came into the cove with the wind at her back and her guns ready. He hailed the William and demanded surrender. The accounts of what happened in the next half hour are some of the best documented in the history of pirate hunting because the trial that followed produced extensive sworn testimony from nearly every survivor on both sides. Rackham was below decks. So were most of his men. They did not come up to fight, according to the testimony of the captured turtling crew who watched the entire engagement from where they had been confined. Only 3 people came up onto the Williams deck to defend her and Bonnie. Mary Reid, and one other man whose name does not appear consistently in the records. The 3 of them fired their pistols. They cut the boarding lines. They cursed at the men below to come up and fight. When the men below did not come up, Mary Reid reportedly fired her pistol down into the hold itself, screaming that if the men would not fight like men, she would shoot them where they cowered. She killed one of her own crew and wounded another. Anne fought beside her. The 2 women held the deck for as long as 2 unarmed women and 1 man could hold the deck against a fully manned pirate hunting sloop. And then they were overwhelmed and disarmed. Barnett's men went below and dragged Rackham and the rest of the crew up at gunpoint. The William was taken to Port Royal under prize. The prisoners were transferred to the jail at Spanish Town. Anne Bonny reportedly saw Rackham one last time before the trials began through the bars of his separate cell. The exact words she spoke have been paraphrased in every history written since, and the paraphrase is consistent enough across sources that historians believe the substance to be accurate. She told him that she was sorry to see him in such a condition, but that if he had fought like a man, he would not now be about to be hanged like a dog. Let that settle for a moment. A captured female pirate, facing her own execution, used her last conversation with her lover to tell him that he had not been man enough. The trial of John Rackham and the male members of his crew began on November the 16th, 1720, in the Court of Vice Admiralty at Spanish Town. The judges were colonial officials acting under a commission from Governor Laws. The verdict was effectively predetermined. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony was abundant, and the political need for a public hanging was clear. Rackham was convicted on the 17th. He was hanged on the 18th at Gallows Point in Port Royal. His body was afterward gibbeted, hung in a metal cage as a public warning to other sailors considering the trade at a small island that is still called Rackham's Cay to this day. The rest of his male crew were hanged in the days that followed. The court then turned its attention to Anne Bonny and Mary Reid. They were tried together on November the 28th. The proceedings were extensively transcribed because the court understood that the case was unusual and that the record would be examined. Witnesses were called. The captured turtling crew testified to what they had seen during the engagement at Negro Point. The other prisoners testified to the women's behavior during the months of piracy that had preceded the capture. The evidence presented was, if anything, more damning than the evidence that had hanged Rackham. The court found Anne Bonny and Mary Reid guilty of piracy. The sentence, as required by law, was death by hanging. The judge asked a standard question that English common law required at the end of a capital sentencing. Did the condemned have anything to say for themselves as to why the sentence should not be carried out? Anne Bonny stood and said, in the words recorded in the trial transcript, that she pleaded her belly. Mary Reid stood beside her and said the same thing. To plead one's belly was a specific phrase in English common law. It meant to claim pregnancy. Under a doctrine that had been part of English law for centuries, a court could not execute a woman who was carrying a child because the child had committed no crime and could not be punished for the mother's offenses. The court was required, when such a plea was entered, to suspend the execution and order a physical examination by a panel of matrons, married women of established reputation, who would determine whether the claim was true. The court did exactly that. The examination was conducted within days. Both women were found to be pregnant. The executions were suspended. The Jamaican legal system, which had hanged Rackham and his men with public efficiency, now found itself holding 2 of the most notorious pirates in the Caribbean in indefinite custody, unable to execute them, unwilling to release them, and entirely unprepared for what to do next. The shock rippled through every colony in the West Indies. Newspapers in Boston and Philadelphia reprinted the story. Letters between colonial governors discussed it. The trial transcript was copied and distributed. Two women had not only sailed as pirates, fought as pirates, and stood condemned as pirates, but had then used a centuries-old piece of common law to defeat their own execution. The empire that had built itself on the assumption that women existed within narrow categories had been outmaneuvered by two women who knew the categories better than the empire did. Mary Read died in prison on April the 28th, 1721. The cause was recorded as fever, which in 18th century Jamaica could have meant anything from yellow fever to typhus to complications of pregnancy. She was buried in a churchyard in St. Catherine Parish. Her child, if she had still been pregnant at the time of her death, did not survive her. The record of Anne Bonny ends, and this is the part that has fascinated historians for 3 centuries, with no recorded death. There's no execution, there's no prison burial. There's no death notice in any colonial newspaper. There's no entry in any official register. Anne Bonny, who had been one of the most documented female criminals in the colonial Caribbean, simply disappears from the written record in the spring of 1721. The disappearance of Anne Bonny is one of the great unresolved questions of pirate history, and it is unresolved precisely because the documentary trail goes cold. So completely, the colonial authorities in Jamaica, who would normally have recorded any disposition of a high-profile prisoner, recorded nothing. There are theories, several are plausible. The most romantic and the least supported is that Anne's father, William Cormack, who was by this point a wealthy planter in Carolina with significant social connections, used those connections and his money to secure her quiet release and her return home under a different name. This theory rests on a single, unverified family tradition recorded more than a century later, which describes a woman matching Anne's description living in South Carolina under the name Anne Burleigh, dying in 1782 at the age of 84, having raised a large family and outlived most of her contemporaries. The genealogical evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. A second theory is that Anne died in prison shortly after Mary Read, and that the colonial authorities, embarrassed by their inability to execute her, simply failed to record her death properly. A third theory is that she was released after giving birth on the grounds that the original sentence had been functionally commuted by the long delay, and that she returned to anonymous life somewhere in the Caribbean. The Charles Johnson account, published in 1724, says only that she was reprieved from time to time, but never tells us what eventually became of her. The author, writing only a few years after the events, did not know, and if he did not know, almost certainly no one outside the prison knew either. The story refused to die. In 1724, the publisher Charles Rivington brought out a book in London titled A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, written under the name of Captain Charles Johnson. The identity of the actual author has been debated for centuries, with some scholars arguing that Johnson was a pseudonym for Daniel Defoe and others arguing that he was a real but obscure sea captain. Whoever he was, he had access to remarkable detail. The book devoted substantial chapters to Anne Bonny and Mary Read, more space than it gave to many of the more successful male pirates of the era, and the chapters were vivid, detailed, and clearly based on sources who had been in Jamaica during the trial. The book was a massive success. It was reprinted, translated, and pirated across Europe. The names of Anne Bonny and Mary Read entered the popular imagination and stayed there. By the late 18th century, they had become characters in folk ballads. By the 19th century, they had become characters in novels. By the 20th century, they had become characters in films, TV shows, comic books, and academic monographs. The trial transcript, which had been carefully preserved by the colonial administration, was rediscovered and republished by historians beginning in the 19th century, and it remains one of the most important primary source documents in the study of women in early modern crime. Their story tells us several things that the official histories of the period would prefer to leave unspoken. It tells us that the categories the empire built for women were always more fragile than they appeared. The wife, the daughter, the widow, the servant. These were not natural facts. They were enforced conditions, and they could be escaped by anyone determined enough to take the risk. Anne Bonny and Mary Read did not invent female piracy. There were others, before and after, whose names have survived in smaller fragments of the record. But Anne and Mary made the existence of such women impossible to ignore, because they fought too publicly and stood trial too publicly to be quietly erased. It tells us that the legal system the empire considered its strongest weapon was full of loopholes that had been written by men for the protection of other men, and that could be exploited by women who knew the rules well enough to turn them around. Pleading the belly was not a trick. It was a recognized legal protection that had existed for centuries. And the fact that it had been written into the law at all was an admission that even the most absolute power of the state had limits. Anne and Mary found those limits and put their hands on them. And it tells us that what an empire chooses to remember is not always what the empire wants to remember. The colonial authorities in Jamaica did not want Anne Bonny and Mary Read to become famous. They wanted them hanged, gibbeted, and forgotten in the same way that Rackham was hanged, gibbeted, and almost forgotten. The fact that we are still talking about Anne and Mary 300 years after the William was taken at Negril Point is a measure of how completely the empire failed at that particular task. The story escaped. It got into the newspapers, it got into the books, it got into the ballads. It became a thing that the empire could no longer control, and once a story escapes that kind of control, it does not come back. Anne Bonny and Mary Read sailed for only a few months. Their piracy was small in scale and modest in profit. They never took a city. They never blockaded a harbor. They never commanded a warship the size of the Queen Anne's Revenge. By the standards of the men who dominated the golden age of piracy, their careers were almost negligible, and yet they are remembered when most of those men are forgotten, because what they did was not measured in tonnage of prizes taken or guns mounted on a deck. What they did was demonstrate in a court of law and in front of every colony in the Atlantic world that the cage the empire had built around women had a door, and that the door could be walked through by anyone willing to accept what was on the other side. The court that sentenced them to death could not kill them. The husband who tried to control Anne could not hold her. The army that Mary served in did not know what she was. The crew that sailed with them did not lead them. The men they loved did not save them. The empire that built itself on the labor of millions of invisible women could not, in the end, make these two invisible. Anne Bonny and Mary Read did not become legends by accident. They put on men's clothes, took up pistols and cutlasses, fought in the front rank of every action they were part of, and when the law finally caught them, they used the law's own rules to defeat the law's own sentence. They were not the most successful pirates of their age. They were not the most violent. They were the two who refused, in every sense the word can carry, to be what they had been told they were 300 years later. Their trial transcript is still in the archives, their names are still in the books, their story is still being told in classrooms and in films and in conversations like this one. Mary Read is buried in a churchyard in Jamaica, in a grave whose exact location was lost generations ago. Anne Bonny is buried, if she is buried at all, in a grave that no one has ever found. They have outlasted the court that sentenced them, the empire that built that court, the colony that ran that empire, and the men who wrote the laws that were supposed to keep women like them from ever existing. Some women were never meant to be remembered. These two refuse.